Well, welcome back, everyone. So today we're going to be looking at the end of Chapter 4, talking about the end of the American Revolution, how the war was won, and also spending a little bit of time talking about some of the ideas and some of the ways that the American Revolution changed American society and even some of the influences that it started to have, although maybe not immediately, but some of the influences that this conflict and the ideals represented in it started to eventually have on the rest of the world. So if you remember, the last place we were as far as the fighting was the tide had definitely been turned in favor of the American side with the addition of the French. The French had made an alliance after the Battle of Saratoga, and that means that French help, the French Navy, French forces, French money, all of that is going to soon. It takes, like I said earlier, about a year for that to happen, but it does eventually mean that all those things are going to start coming to the colonists' aid. So that's going to be very important to their success, particularly in the final campaign of the war, which will be Yorktown. Before we get to Yorktown, we're going to just do a very, very quick fast forward, super crash course version of what was happening in the final years of the war leading up to Yorktown. So we had the victory, the American victory at Saratoga, the British defeat at Saratoga, which resulted in the French alliance. So at this point, around 1778, the British are going to change their strategy once again. Just as they moved the war to the middle colonies around 1776, after 1778, moving into 1779, they are going to shift their focus once again and move the war to the south. So they are going to start concentrating their attacks on southern colonies. So in these last few years of the war, most of the fighting is actually being done in Georgia, in South Carolina, and places like that. The reason being, there were far more loyalists in the south. As we've discussed before. And so the idea was to fight in more friendly territory. There are parts of this, there are campaigns here in which most of the fighting on the British side was actually being done by loyalist colonists. So they changed their game, changed their location, and changing their overall strategy in an attempt to try to win this, to have more success in the South and win the war before too much French help became available, before that French help really started coming online and started having an effect, and before they really are having to tangle with France. And for a while that works. At first, the war in the South went very, very badly for the American side. The British seemed to be on a tear throughout the South. They capture major southern cities like Charleston and Savannah. They occupy many parts of South Carolina and Georgia, and things are not looking very good. There are eventually some battles that we are not going to discuss, but some turning point battles in the South, like Cowpens in South Carolina, that eventually turn the tide in favor of the colonies, and they will eventually start being able to push the British out of the South, pushing them towards Virginia. And that is how we set up this final campaign and what's going to become the final battle of the war at Yorktown. Now, in command of British forces, here is General Cornwallis. We haven't really mentioned any specific generals, but since we are here at the end of the conflict, I want to go ahead and mention his name. So when we talk about that final surrender and the British strategy and all of that, we know who we are associating that with. So General Cornwallis was in command of British forces in this final phase of the war, and he will be in command of British forces at Yorktown when the British finally surrender and we have the end of the conflict. So Cornwallis eventually gets pushed out of the South, out of South Carolina, up through North Carolina, and eventually into Virginia, where he is going to encamp his forces on the retreat and brings his forces to Yorktown, Virginia, setting up the final campaign and the final battle of the war, the Battle of Yorktown. So Cornwallis retreats to Yorktown. Yorktown is right on the water. It's right on the Chesapeake Bay. So the reason that Cornwallis retreated his troops and encamped them there at Yorktown was because it was right there on the water. And the idea was to wait there for reinforcements to arrive, to await there on the water so that reinforcements of more fresh troops and ammunition and supplies and all of those things could be brought. And then he could regroup from there and then go about continuing attacking American forces. But by this time, again, not only are Americans ready to go, but also a lot of French help has arrived. There are multiple French forces that are there and the assistance of the French Navy. And so the French Navy is actually going to be blockading the coast there, right there at Yorktown, meaning that Cornwallis isn't going to be able to get those reinforcements, nor is he going to be able to escape. So that blocks him in, and he is locked in and basically trapped at Yorktown. Realizing that Cornwallis and all his men are trapped at Yorktown, Washington sees the opportunity. He sees the opportunity to attack, and he orders all Continental and French forces to concentrate there on Yorktown and try to end this right there, getting the British to a place where they could not get away, where they would be outnumbered and surrounded. So there's a whole lengthy campaign around Yorktown, British eventually getting very, very desperate, but that does result eventually in General Cornwallis surrendering to General Washington, surrendering his army to Washington October 19th, 1781. So surrounded, outnumbered, unable to get enforcements, unable to get away, he surrenders to Washington. And that is important because this turns out to be the end of the war. Yorktown turns out to be the final campaign of the war. So we consider this the end of the American Revolution, or the end of the Revolutionary War, the end of the fighting. Now, that may not have been totally apparent right then at the very, very beginning. But this is the last major campaign of the war. So we consider the war over at that point. Now, there have been peace talks going on actually a while before this. There had been a peace delegation that was already in Britain trying to work out some kind of an agreement. But after Yorktown, the British realized that this is no longer winnable for them. They realized that to keep fighting is just going to be costly. And you have to remember, at this point, the war has escalated into something far bigger than they ever intended. This all started as an attempt to try to put down a relatively, a significant but still somewhat minor colonial rebellion. And now it has evolved into essentially a world war. They are not only fighting the American colonies, they are fighting France and Spain. And this has blown up in their face far more than they would have liked. And they also realized that they could keep fighting if they wanted to, but the colonists, the Americans are going to keep on fighting as well. This has gotten very, very expensive. It has worn them down, and they are just no longer interested in pursuing it. And as I've said before, independence just in the long run mattered more to the American colonists than reconquest and reclaiming of these colonies did for Britain. So after Yorktown, Britain eventually decides not to pursue this any further militarily, and the peace negotiations proceed, resulting in a peace treaty 2 years after, or nearly 2 years after the ending of the fighting. These kind of things took a long time in these days. The Treaty of Paris, 1783. Not to be confused with the Treaty of Paris, 1763. I mentioned before there are multiple ones, so you got to keep all these straight. So the Treaty of Paris 1783 ends the Revolutionary War, ends or ceases the conflict and the hostilities between the American colonists, or the United States rather, and the British. Furthermore, Britain recognizes the independence of the new United States, recognizes the United States as an independent nation, a legitimate government, recognizing that they are no longer colonies of Britain, that they have no allegiance or no responsibilities or anything like that towards the British government. So, of course, that's the big thing, and what this conflict, the goal of it had been for so long, maybe not from the beginning, but certainly since the Declaration was signed and issued. Furthermore, as well as declaring the United States independent politically, this also means Britain's giving up territory, because that was territory that belonged to them. So the other big thing with the Treaty of Paris has to do with establishing the boundaries and the territory for this new United States. So they set the boundary, the western boundary at the Mississippi River. So they're granting the new United States all the land all the way to the Mississippi River and as far south as Spanish Florida. And if you were wondering, this is also the point where Florida is going to revert back to Spain. So the northern boundary will be Canada, Great Lakes area and all of that. The western boundary, the Mississippi River, and the southern boundary being Spanish Florida. There are some other things in there like repayment of debts and treatment of loyalists and all kinds of other things, but those are sort of the big ones, recognizing independence of the new United States and setting up those boundaries that we'll look at again a little bit later. To conclude, we want to talk just a little bit about how the war affects that society, both society in the world and also groups in society. And we talked about this a little bit in the previous section with looking at how the war affected women and African Americans, and we are going to hit a little bit again on some of those things. So we're going to start with just looking at how some of the ideas that the revolution championed, some of the ideas that the revolution supported, and with the victory. And keep in mind, this was not just a victory, this was a very unlikely victory. The idea that a bunch of colonial farmers could defeat the most powerful nation on earth, that said something pretty powerful, not just about those individuals, but about the ideas that they supported. This was remarkable, not just in the fact that, we're fighting for freedom, we're fighting for the idea that a government's power comes from the people. That's so crazy. But it was remarkable that people could have those ideas and at the same time defeat the most powerful nation on earth. I mean, it really, it kind of sets the stage for this. There's a concept that is called American exceptionalism. This idea that Americans are somehow special, that Americans are different, that Americans are unique in some kind of a way. And it really kind of starts here, maybe even before that, but we're going to see that, come up quite a lot. But it's definitely, certainly enforced. It may have not started, but certainly enforced by the events of the American Revolution and the way things panned out. But some of those ideas are things like egalitarianism. And that is a very strange looking and hard sounding word for something that's really kind of simple, although complicated. And that's equality. Egalitarianism just means equality. It means the belief in the equality of all people. Now, this is where it gets kind of complicated for us, because we know that when the founding fathers wrote all men are created equal, and when they talked about egalitarianism and all people being equal, their view of that was not the same as ours. And that is sometimes a difficult thing for us to wrestle with. And we oftentimes very much struggle with that concept and how we should look at it. But the truth is, no, they did not mean everyone. In their minds, no, it did not include women. It did not include African Americans. It did not include all people. But we must also give credit to the fact that it was still quite exceptional for them to say that all people were equal, all men, property owning men, but the idea that anybody could own property. They are still rejecting a centuries old tradition of, people that had value, that was passed down. They are rejecting the idea of hereditary aristocracy. They are rejecting the idea of nobility, of inherited titles, that some people, just by virtue of being born into the right family and having the right name and all of that, that some people were somehow better and entitled to more rights and privileges. They were rejecting that and saying that anybody can obtain those things. Once again, when they said anybody, no, they did not mean women and so forth. But as we see, we have built upon those ideas as time has gone along, and our version of that information now is much more inclusive. So it's a hard thing to reckon with, and I don't mean to say we shouldn't acknowledge those shortcomings, but we should also, in acknowledging those shortcomings, should remember how revolutionary it truly was. And these ideas of egalitarianism, which has a tendency to be anti-monarchy and anti-aristocracy and all this eventually affects more than just the United States. There will be revolutions in other parts of the world over the next several decades that are directly inspired by the American Revolution. Those same ideas are going to inspire people in France, for example, just, less than 10 years after this, to say, what is up with this? Certain people have more rights than everybody else, yet they only make up like 2% of the population. This will have a direct impact on things like the French Revolution, which I'm sure you looked at in American history, modeled directly after the American Revolution, inspired by the same ideas and the whole of, if they can do it, then so can we. We will also see this in Latin America, in Central and South America, all those Spanish colonies we talked about before. Over the next couple of decades, almost all of those countries will have revolutions, again, steeped in the same ideology of representative government, of power to the people, and the idea that regular folks could overthrow a powerful European government. So those ideas are going to have far-reaching consequences in other parts of the world. Those same things, those same revolutions, French Revolution, Latin American revolutions, and so forth, are also inspired by the concept of republicanism, or the concept of a republic. And we've used this word a couple of times throughout this, but really haven't stopped to talk about it and what this means. A republic means a representative government. Thus, the first three letters of that word, rep, is in representation or representative. A republic is a government that represents the people, a government in which power comes from the people. We have talked about at length about how the colonists believed, because of their history and because of the Enlightenment and things like that, they believe in government that represents the people, that government in which power comes from the people. That is a republic type of government. And to believe in such is to be a Republican. We tend to think of Republican as the modern day political party. In this case, we need to disassociate from that a little bit. But there are reasons related to that as to why that party is named that. But anyway, it is a government in which power comes from the citizens, that represents the people. And this is what many Americans would have argued they were fighting for, was for a Republican form of government as opposed to a monarchy. And that same idea, again, translates into other revolutions in the world. The French Revolution was based on the same concept. We want a republic that represents the people, and eventually establishing a French republic. And the same will be true in Latin America and several other places. So this does eventually have broad consequences in lots of different parts of the world. We are also going to see really as soon as independence is established, before the first real creation of a real national government, individual, what were once colonies, what are now states, are going to be writing new state constitutions, creating new state governments that represent some of these same values, that create republics within the state. And these new state constitutions reflect some of these beliefs that the revolution was based upon, such as that a government's power has to be limited. Just having a constitution in and of itself supports that idea, or is based on that idea that government's powers are limited, that powers need to be listed, that they need to be written down, that there needs to be a specific, list of things a government can do and things that they can't do. Most of these new state constitutions created three-branch governments. Many of them already had that as colonies, but they are still reinforcing that concept that government's power needed to be limited by division, that you needed to divide it into different branches, an executive, a legislative, and a judicial. Also, these new state constitutions tended to heavily concentrate power, though, in the legislative branch. Most of them have more power in the legislative branch than any other, because the legislative branch, the lawmaking group that was usually elected by the people in some way, shape, or form, they saw that as needing to be the most powerful one, because that was the one that most reflected the will of the people. So that'll be important a little bit later on when we talk about the formation of the first national government for the United States. Most of these new state constitutions, many of them contained a Bill of Rights based off of the English Bill of Rights that contained specific rights of the people, like the right to a trial by jury, the right to bear arms, protections of properties, right to fair and speedy trial, these sorts of things. And all of those are going to have great influences on the first national government of the United States, as well as reflecting the very beliefs and foundations of the Revolution itself. Those new state constitutions are also going to, in many ways, increase freedom of religion. Now, interestingly, here you may be going, religion, we haven't really talked about religion. The revolution was not based on any religious ideas. Well, perhaps not directly, but it does result actually in more freedom of religion in the United States. In fact, it is the revolution that is eventually going to result in the complete and total separation of church and state in the new United States. We have been looking at that concept of separation of church and state, separation of government and church. And while there were plenty of colonies there were some that never had established churches, that always had separation of church and state because they never had an official church that was tax supported and state sponsored. There are also those that did not. There were still plenty, like, say, we'll use Virginia as an example. Virginia still had, throughout the Revolution, the Church of England, what is known as the Anglican Church in this country, was still the church. That was still, you didn't have to go, attendance wasn't mandatory or anything, but your taxes supported it no matter what. And it was, state sponsored. But in most colonies that still had, like Virginia, that still had a state-supported church, and most of them, it was the Church of England. And you can imagine how during the Revolution, people might have started to get a sour taste in their mouth when it came to the Church of England. And all of the anti-English rhetoric, causes people to want to sever that tie as well. So what we're going to see as a result of the war is the big word, the big fancy word, disestablishment, in that we're going to see any colonies like Virginia that still had an official church will be disestablishing that church, which means just cutting that cord, severing that tie, and no longer having official state-supported churches. So we eventually get the complete and total separation of church and state, which translates to the United States as a national government has never had, an official church. There has never been an official religion. And there would be total separation of church and state when it came to the national government. So that's what we mean by freedom of religion in that case. The war also has a profound effect on slavery. We looked in the previous section about the service of African American soldiers and how many were freed as a result of their service, either from their service in the British Army, but also the same promise was made eventually to those who fought in the Continental Army. So we are going to see a massive amount of emancipation. Emancipation is a fancy word for the freeing of slaves in a legal way. So we are going to see that for a number of reasons. One, we already mentioned military service, that there are thousands that are going to receive their freedom because of their military service. Not all of them do. It depends on the situation. most of them fighting for the British Army. But we are also at this point going to start to see many northern states start to ban slavery. This is the part where we start to see slavery be abolished in some places. Remember that slavery was legal and practiced in all 13 colonies up until the Revolution, but particularly in, say, for example, the New England colonies, in which slavery was never as prevalent as it was everywhere else. Some of them are going to start getting rid of it. When they establish those new state constitutions, a provision of many of them is no more slavery. It wouldn't be allowed anymore. And some of that is, yeah, they didn't really need it, but it is because they saw the inconsistency and they saw the flaw in fighting for freedom and independence and all of those rights and things like that while denying that to other people. So it was not lost on them that those things were not compatible. There are other states, particularly in the middle, what were middle colonies, places like New York, Pennsylvania, that will start laying out gradual plans to get rid of slavery. So some of them may not get rid of it immediately, but they might start gradually phasing it out, perhaps by saying that slave owners had, to free all their slaves in the next 20 years, or by saying that from this point forward, all the children of slaves will be free, things along those lines, or that you could not import any new slaves. So that will eventually result in, as we move into the 19th century, we'll start to see less and less slavery in the North. Of course, there's going to be no attempts whatsoever to abolish slavery in the South, but we're starting to see that division between those states that allow slavery and those that do not. But the Revolutionary War is quite significant in regards to slavery, in that no single event frees more people at one time than the Revolution does, until the Civil War, of course, when we'll see slavery outright abolished everywhere. So it does have a profound effect on it. We should remind ourselves, though, that this freedom does not mean equality, unfortunately. So just because slaves were being freed in some places and many were gaining freedom in the North, that does not mean full rights. That it doesn't mean that all these states allowed African Americans to vote or own property. Some of them did, or eventually would. But we must remember that those two things were not seen as having to coexist with each other. They were not seen as dependent on one another. So African Americans would still face discrimination, unequal position, and things like that, not just in the South. So it is quite a complicated picture. So now we have seen these former colonies, and that's always a challenge, is to remind ourselves not to call them colonies anymore, but states, and these new Americans fight and win a very unlikely victory here, and inspiring themselves and inspiring people throughout the world to fight for similar causes. In the next chapter, we will turn to how do we govern ourselves now? What kind of a government do we create? And how will we translate some of these same ideas into that new government that we're going to create? So that's what we'll be looking at next time when we talk about the formation of the Constitution.